They say respect is earned, not given. But what happens when the very people you raised, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally decide you're no longer worthy of that respect? What happens when your own flesh and blood looks you in the eye and calls you incompetent? My name is Lillian King, but everyone calls me Lily. I'm 73 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've been managing my 3 adult children's monthly expenses. Not because they asked me to, mind you, but because I wanted to help. Because that's what mothers do. We give, we sacrifice, we support, even when our children are well into their 30s and 40s. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But last Tuesday evening, everything changed. In one cruel moment, my eldest son decided that his mother had become a burden rather than a blessing. He declared me too senile to handle money, too old to be trusted with something as simple as basic arithmetic. What he didn't know was that this supposedly senile old woman was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. The mahogany dining table had seen better days, much like myself, I suppose. Its surface bore the gentle scars of decades, of family meals, homework sessions, and countless conversations that shaped the lives of 3 children who once called this house home. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the lace curtains my late husband Harold had always complained about, casting dancing shadows across the faces of my adult children as they gathered for our monthly family dinner. These dinners had become sacred to me after Harold passed 5 years ago. They were my anchor, my proof that despite the empty house and the silence that filled it most days, I was still needed, still relevant in the lives of the people I'd poured my entire existence into raising. Michael sat at the head of the table where his father used to sit, his broad shoulders filling out his expensive navy suit jacket. At 42, he'd inherited his father's strong jawline and my stubborn streak, though he'd somehow missed the lesson about treating your elders with respect. His wife Jennifer picked at her salad beside him, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her fork in that nervous way she had when she was anxious about something. Across from them sat my daughter Sarah, 38 and perpetually frazzled from managing her 2 teenage boys while working full-time as a nurse. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair hastily pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better hours. The exhaustion in her eyes spoke of someone carrying more weight than she should, yet she still managed to smile when she caught me looking at her. My youngest, David, had claimed his usual spot closest to the kitchen, probably hoping for easier access to seconds. At 35, he still had that boyish charm that had gotten him out of trouble more times than I could count. Though lately, that charm hadn't been enough to keep his life on track. The conversation flowed as it always did during these gatherings. Sarah updated us on her boys' soccer season and her struggles with the hospital's new administration. David regaled us with stories from his latest job as a freelance graphic designer, carefully omitting the details about how sporadic his income actually was. Michael discussed his latest business ventures with the kind of authority he'd cultivated since becoming a regional manager at his firm. I listened, as I always did, storing away every detail like precious treasures. These glimpses into their adult lives were gifts to me, proof that despite the mistakes I'd surely made as a mother, they'd grown into decent human beings with their own dreams and struggles. The trouble started when Jennifer brought up their mortgage payment. "Mom, Lily," she said, using the name she'd called me since she and Michael started dating 15 years ago, "I wanted to thank you again for taking care of our mortgage this month. I know it's a big help, especially with Michael's promotion still pending." I nodded, taking a sip of the sweet tea I'd made from my mother's recipe. "It's no trouble at all, dear. That's what family does." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'd noticed this reaction before whenever the topic of money came up. Pride was a difficult thing for a man to swallow, especially when his mother was the one keeping his family afloat. "Actually," Michael said, his voice carrying that tone he used in business meetings, Jennifer and I have been talking. We think maybe it's time we took back control of our finances. Sarah looked up from her plate, surprise flickering across her tired features. Really? But Mom's system works so well. She's never missed a payment, never been late with anything. That was true. For 15 years, I'd managed their bills with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Every mortgage payment, every car note, every insurance premium, every utility bill, all handled from my modest kitchen table with my old calculator and my careful handwriting in the ledger I'd kept since the arrangement began. It had started, innocently enough. Sarah had been struggling as a new single mother, and I'd offered to help with her daycare payments. David had been between jobs and needed assistance with his rent. Michael and Jennifer had been newlyweds trying to save for their first house while managing student loans and credit card debt from their wedding. What began as temporary assistance had evolved into a comprehensive financial management system. I paid their bills, they provided me with the money, and everyone benefited from my meticulous organization and attention to detail. It gave them peace of mind and gave me purpose. The thing is, Michael continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard him use with his subordinates at work. We're concerned about putting so much responsibility on Mom's shoulders. She's getting older, and we don't want to burden her with our problems. The words stung, but I maintained my composure. I don't consider it a burden, Michael. I enjoy helping you all. Jennifer reached across the table and patted my hand, with the kind of gentle touch people reserved for invalids. We know you do, Mom Lily. But you're 73 now, and sometimes people your age start to, well, get confused about numbers and things. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. David stopped, eating mid-bite, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked between her brother and sister-in-law. Confused about numbers? I repeated slowly, my voice steady despite the storm building inside my chest. Michael leaned forward, his expression taking on what I can only describe as false kindness. The kind of look adults give children when they're about to explain something they think is too complicated for young minds to understand. Mom, last week when we were going over the bills, you said our mortgage payment was $847, but it's actually $874. You mixed up the numbers. The memory came flooding back. I had indeed stated the wrong amount, but not because of confusion or age-related decline. I'd been testing something, following a hunch that had been nagging at me for months. The discrepancy I'd noticed in their account balance hadn't made sense, and I'd wanted to see how they'd react to an intentional error. Their reaction had told me everything I needed to know. I see, I said quietly, setting down my glass with deliberate care. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Jennifer added quickly. My grandmother started having trouble with numbers when she was around your age. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's perfectly normal. Normal. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. They thought my decades of financial acumen, my years of managing not just their bills but my own household, my late husband's business accounts, and various community organization treasuries, could be dismissed as age-related decline because of one transposed number. Sarah finally found her voice. Michael, that's not fair. Mom's sharper than all of us combined when it comes to money. Remember when she caught that error in your tax return 3 years ago? The one your accountant missed? That was 3 years ago, Michael replied dismissively. People change, Sarah. They decline. It's a fact of life. David set down his fork, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something harder. Are you seriously calling Mom senile right now? I'm not calling her senile, Michael said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm just saying that maybe it's time we face reality. Mom's getting older, and it's not fair to her or to us to pretend otherwise. The patronizing kindness, In his voice was worse than outright cruelty would have been. It carried the weight of finality, as if my competence was no longer a matter for debate, but a foregone conclusion. I looked around the table at the faces of my children. Sarah appeared, stricken, her loyalty torn between defending me and avoiding family conflict. David looked angry. His jaw clenched in the same way his father's used to when he was trying to control his temper. And Michael sat there with that insufferable expression of someone who believed he was being reasonable while delivering an unreasonable verdict. Jennifer, perhaps sensing the tension she'd helped create, attempted to soften the blow. "We're not saying you can't help with other things, Mom Lily. Maybe you could still help with groceries or smaller expenses. Just not the big stuff that requires, precision." Precision. As if I hadn't been handling their big stuff with flawless precision for 15 years. As if I hadn't saved Michael's credit score twice, hadn't kept Sarah's lights on. During her darkest financial periods, hadn't prevented David from losing his car more times than I could count. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, each pulse carrying a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else. A crystalline clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. When I spoke, my voice was calm, measured, and absolutely final. "I understand," I said, looking directly at Michael. "You think I'm too senile to handle money responsibly." "Mom, that's not what we're saying." Sarah started, but I held up a gentle hand to stop her. "No, dear, it's quite all right. Michael has made his position very clear. He believes that his 73-year-old mother, who has managed finances successfully for more years than he's been alive, is no longer competent to handle something as simple as bill paying." Michael's face reddened slightly. "I didn't say incompetent. You said senile," I interrupted, my voice still eerily calm. "You said I was confused about numbers. You said it wasn't fair to any of us to pretend otherwise about my declining mental state." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat. David muttered something under his breath that sounded like profanity. I stood slowly, my movements deliberate and dignified. "Well then, I suppose there's only one reasonable solution to this problem." Sarah looked up at me with worried eyes. "Mom, what do you mean?" I smiled at her, the kind of smile I'd perfected over decades of motherhood. Warm, loving, and completely non-negotiable. "I mean, my dear, that effective immediately, I will no longer be handling any of your monthly bill payments. Any of you." The reaction was immediate and varied. Sarah's face went pale. David's mouth fell open. Jennifer looked confused, as if she couldn't quite process what I'd said. And Michael looked skeptical, as if he didn't quite believe. I was serious. "Mom, you don't have to do that," Sarah said quickly. "Michael didn't speak for all of us." "Actually, he did," I replied, beginning to clear the dishes with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd hosted countless family dinners. "He made it very clear that I'm no longer mentally sharp enough to be trusted with financial responsibilities. And you know what? He's absolutely right to be concerned." I paused in my clearing, looking around the table at each of them in turn. After all, what if my declining mental state caused me to make an error? What if I forgot to pay a bill, or paid the wrong amount, or sent money to the wrong account? The consequences could be devastating. Michael frowned, clearly not expecting this response. "Mom, you're being dramatic." "Am I?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "I'm simply taking your concerns seriously, Michael. You said it yourself. It's not fair to any of us to pretend otherwise about my condition." I continued clearing dishes, my movements calm and methodical. "So, to protect all of us from the potential consequences of my senility, I'll be withdrawing from all financial arrangements we currently have. Tomorrow morning, I'll begin the process of removing my name from your accounts and canceling all automatic payments I've been making on your behalf. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads as they began to process what this would actually mean for their monthly budgets. Jennifer was the first to speak, her voice small and uncertain. "But Mom Lily, we depend on your help. We appreciate your help." "I'm sure you do, dear," I replied sweetly. "But as Michael so thoughtfully pointed out, I'm too old and confused to be trusted with such important responsibilities. Surely you wouldn't want someone with declining mental faculties handling your mortgage payments?" David finally found his voice. "Mom, this is crazy. Michael was being an ass, but that doesn't mean—" "Language, David," I chided gently, though I appreciated his defense. "And it's not crazy at all. It's the most sensible solution to the problem your brother has identified." I moved toward the kitchen, carrying a stack of plates. After all, wouldn't it be terrible if my senile old brain forgot to pay Michael's mortgage and he lost his house? Or if I confused David's car payment with his rent and he lost his transportation? Or if I mixed up Sarah's insurance premium and left her boys without coverage? Each hypothetical scenario landed like a physical blow. I could see the realization dawning on their faces as they began to understand the full scope of what they were about to lose. "Mom," Sarah said urgently, "please don't do this. We can work something out. Michael didn't mean—" "Oh, but he did. Mean it, sweetheart," I called from the kitchen as I began loading the dishwasher. "He meant every word. And honestly, I'm grateful that he brought this issue to my attention before something terrible happened." I returned to the dining room, wiping my hands on the dish towel I'd carried with me. The sight that greeted me would have been comical under different circumstances. 3 adults sat frozen at my dining table, looking like children who'd just realized they'd broken something precious and irreplaceable. "Now then," I said brightly, "since we've settled that matter, who wants dessert? I made Harold's favorite apple pie." The offer was met with stunned silence. Michael's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Jennifer stared at her. Hands. Sarah looked as if she might cry. "Mom," Michael said finally, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Maybe we can discuss this?" "There's nothing to discuss," I replied firmly. "You've made your position clear, and I'm simply respecting it. I wouldn't want to burden any of you with my senile assistance any longer." David pushed back from the table abruptly. "This is insane. Michael, tell her you didn't mean it." "I didn't say senile," Michael protested weakly. "I said concerned about—" "You said I was getting confused about numbers," I interrupted. "You said people my age start to decline. You said it wasn't fair to any of us to pretend otherwise. Were those not your exact words?" Michael's silence was answer enough. I looked around the table one final time, memorizing their faces in this moment. These were my children, the people I'd sacrificed everything for, and they'd just learned that actions have consequences. "The pie is on the counter if anyone wants some," I said softly. "I think I'll retire for the evening. It's been quite an enlightening day." I walked toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, pausing at the doorway to look back. "Oh, and Michael? Your mortgage payment is due on the 15th, your car payment on the 22nd, insurance on the 28th. I'd write that down if I were you, assuming, of course, that you're not too senile to handle a pen." With that, I left them sitting at my dining table, surrounded by the remnants of what might have been our last family dinner for quite some time. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. Sadness for what had been lost, the easy rhythm of our family dynamic, the trust that had been broken, the respect that had been withdrawn. But anticipation, too, for what was to come. Because Michael was about to learn something that apparently 15 years of flawless financial management hadn't taught him. His mother was far sharper than he'd given her credit for. And tomorrow, the real education would begin. I had raised 3 children, buried a husband, managed a household through recessions and recoveries, and navigated the complex waters of family finances for longer than my son had been making decisions for himself. If he thought one transposed number made me incompetent, he was about to discover just how competent this supposedly senile old woman really was. As I turned off the bedside lamp, I smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and probably a great deal of panic from my children. But tonight, I slept peacefully, knowing that sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is let her children learn from their own mistakes, even if those mistakes were about to cost them everything. The morning after what I'd already begun, thinking of as the dinner that changed everything, I woke before dawn as I had every day for the past 50 years. Harold used to tease me about my internal alarm clock, saying I was more reliable than the rooster we'd kept on the farm during our early married years. Some habits, I suppose, die harder than the people who shape them. I made my coffee in the same white ceramic mug Harold had given me for our 10th anniversary, the one with the tiny chip on the handle that I'd refused to replace despite my children's countless offers to buy me a new set. There was comfort in familiar imperfections, something my generation understood better than the current one with their constant need to upgrade and replace anything that showed signs of wear. The kitchen table was covered with the same manila folders I'd been using to organize my children's finances for 15 years. Each folder bore a neat label written in my careful cursive: Michael and Jennifer, mortgage and utilities; Sarah, medical and transportation; David, rent and miscellaneous. Inside each folder were copies of every bill, every payment confirmation, every correspondence with creditors or service providers. I'd kept meticulous records, not because I didn't trust my memory, but because I'd learned long ago that when it came to money, documentation was everything. This morning, those folders felt heavier than usual as I carried them to my desk in the front parlor. The room had served as Harold's office when he was alive, and I'd maintained it exactly as he'd left it. His leather chair still bore the impression of his body. His fountain pen still lay beside the blotter where he'd placed it the night before his heart attack. Sometimes I caught myself expecting to see him hunched over his ledgers, muttering about quarterly taxes or supply costs for the hardware store he'd owned for 37 years. But today wasn't about Harold or memories or the weight of loss that still settled on my shoulders like morning fog. Today was about action. I opened Michael's folder first, not out of favoritism, but because his was the most complex. As the eldest and the one who'd initiated yesterday's confrontation, it seemed fitting that his financial untangling should receive my immediate attention. The mortgage alone was a labyrinthine arrangement. They'd refinanced twice in the past, 5 years, each time lowering their monthly payment, but extending their terms. I'd advised against it both times, but Michael had insisted he knew what he was doing. The current payment was indeed $874, due on the 15th of each month. But there were also the property taxes I paid quarterly, the homeowner's insurance I renewed annually, and the PMI that would continue for another 3 years. Then there were the utilities: electric, gas, water, sewer, trash collection, internet, cable, 2 cell phone lines, and Michael's company car insurance that his employer required but didn't fully cover. 13 separate bills, each with different due dates, different payment methods, different customer service numbers for when problems arose. I reached for my phone and dialed the mortgage company first. "Good morning. This is Lillian King, calling about account number 47892361. I need to remove myself as an authorized user and discontinue all automatic payments from my account." The customer service representative, a young woman with a cheerful voice that reminded me of Sarah at that age, tried to be helpful. "Mrs. King, I see here that you've been making payments on this account for many years. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine, dear," I replied. "I'm simply no longer able to handle these responsibilities. My son has decided that I'm too old to manage financial matters reliably." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Let me transfer you to our account services department." The next representative was older, more businesslike. He explained the process for removing authorized users and canceling automatic payments. There would be paperwork to sign, forms to notarize, a processing period of 5 to 7 business days. "I understand," I said. "Please begin that process immediately. And please note in the account that effective immediately, Mr. Michael King will be solely responsible for all future payments and correspondence." "Ma'am, I have to ask. The next payment is due in 6 days. Will Mr. King be prepared to handle that on his own?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I'm sure he'll figure something out. He's a very capable man." The utilities were easier. Most allowed me to remove my payment information and authorized user status with a simple phone call. The electric company required a 3-way call with Michael to confirm the change, so I dutifully dialed his work number. "Mom?" His voice carried a note of surprise when his secretary put me through. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is wonderful, dear. I have the electric company on the line. They need your verbal authorization to remove me from your account and cancel the automatic payments." Silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could practically hear him processing the reality of what I was doing. "Mom, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to discuss, Michael. You made your position quite clear yesterday. The electric company representative has been very patient, but I'm sure she has other customers to help." The 3-way call was completed in tense efficiency. Michael provided the necessary authorizations, his voice growing tighter with each confirmation. When we finished, the representative cheerfully informed him that his next bill would be mailed directly to his address and payment would be his responsibility. "Your next billing cycle begins in 12 days, Mr. King. The average monthly charge for your address is approximately $237. After I hung up, my phone rang immediately. Michael, of course. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You're proving my point about—" I disconnected the call. The phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail. By lunchtime, I'd made 17 phone calls. Michael's financial life had been systematically dismantled from my involvement with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Every automatic payment canceled. Every authorized user privilege revoked. Every safety net I'd provided for 15 years methodically removed. I moved on to Sarah's folder next. Her situation was more heartbreaking because, unlike Michael, she genuinely needed my help. As a single mother working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, she barely had time to sleep, let alone manage the complex dance of bills and due dates that kept her small household functioning. Her car payment went through a credit union that required an in-person visit to change payment methods. I drove there after lunch, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the gravity of what I was doing. The loan officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked genuinely concerned when I explained my situation. "Mrs. King, your daughter's payment history shows she's been late several times when you weren't handling the payments directly. Are you sure about this change?" "I'm certain," I replied, signing the necessary forms with my careful signature. "My family has decided I'm no longer competent to handle financial responsibilities." He frowned, glancing at the papers and then back at my face. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, you seem perfectly competent to me. You've maintained this account flawlessly for 4 years. That's very kind of you to say, but my son believes otherwise. And since he's family, surely his opinion carries more weight than a stranger's." The loan officer shook his head but processed the paperwork. Sarah's next car payment would be due in 18 days, and it would be her responsibility to remember, budget for, and submit on time. Her medical bills were a nightmare of complexity that made me realize how much I'd been shielding her from. Sarah had excellent insurance through the hospital, but the copays, deductibles, and out-of-network charges created a constant stream of bills from different providers. I'd been managing payment plans with 6 different medical offices, negotiating, reduced payments when necessary, and ensuring nothing went to collections. Each call to cancel these arrangements required a conversation with a billing department representative who seemed genuinely confused by my request. Mrs. King, you've been handling your daughter's account for 2 years. The payment plan we arranged has been working perfectly. Why would you want to cancel it now? Because my family has determined that I'm too old to handle such responsibilities reliably, I explained patiently. They're concerned about my mental decline. But your payment history is flawless. You've never missed a due date or sent an incorrect amount. Nevertheless, my son believes I'm becoming senile, and I'm sure he knows best. These conversations were perhaps the most difficult, not because of their complexity, but because the concern in these strangers' voices highlighted the absence of similar concern from my own children. People who interacted with me professionally saw no signs of mental decline, no evidence of confusion or incompetence. Yet my own son had pronounced me unfit based on a single transposed number. By the time I reached David's folder, it was late. Afternoon, and my phone had collected 14 voicemail messages from my children. I didn't listen to them. There would be time for their panic later, once they fully understood the consequences of their assumptions about my capabilities. David's financial arrangements were the most precarious of the 3. His freelance income was irregular, his expenses were modest but inflexible, and he had a tendency to take on projects that paid poorly but appealed to his artistic sensibilities. I'd been managing his rent, car insurance, health insurance, and student loan payments, often covering shortfalls when his income dipped below his expenses. His landlord was an elderly man named Mr. Petrosky, who'd owned the duplex for 40 years. When I called to explain that I'd no longer be handling David's rent payments, his response was immediate and worried. "Mrs. King, your boy is good people, but he's not good with money. Last time you didn't pay his rent, I had to serve him an eviction notice." "I understand your concern, Mr. Petrosky, but my family has decided I'm too old and confused to handle financial matters." "Confused? Lady, you're the most organized person I deal with. You pay early, you keep perfect records, you call if there's ever going to be a problem. Most landlords dream of tenants like you." "I appreciate that, but my son believes I'm becoming senile." Mr. Petrosky was quiet for a moment. "Your son's an idiot." Despite everything, I laughed. "Perhaps, but he's my idiot." "Well, you tell your idiot that David's rent is due on the 1st, no exceptions. And if he's late more than twice, he's out. I can't run a charity here." The student loan company was less sympathetic. The representative informed me that David's loans had been in forbearance for 6 months, a temporary measure I'd arranged when his income dropped to almost nothing during a slow period. That forbearance was set to expire in 30 days, at which point his full payment of $412 would resume. "Will Mr. King be prepared to handle that payment schedule?" the representative asked. "I'm sure he'll manage. Somehow," I replied, though privately I doubted David even remembered the forbearance was temporary. As the sun began to set, I sat in Harold's chair surrounded by the detritus of my children's financial lives. Confirmation numbers, cancellation receipts, and forms requiring notarization covered every surface of the desk. My careful filing system, built over 15 years of dedicated management, had been systematically dismantled in a single day. The phone rang again. Sarah this time, according to the caller ID. I answered on the 4th ring. "Mom, please tell me Michael is exaggerating." Her voice was strained, exhausted in a way that went beyond her usual post-shift fatigue. "He says you're canceling everything." "Not canceling, dear. Simply removing myself from accounts where I'm no longer wanted or needed." "But I need you," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I can't keep track of all these bills while working double shifts. You know I can't." My heart clenched at the pain in her voice, but I kept my tone gentle and firm. "Sarah, sweetheart, Your brother made it very clear yesterday that I'm too old and confused to handle financial responsibilities. Surely you wouldn't want someone with declining mental faculties managing your medical bills. Michael was being an ass. That doesn't mean... Michael was speaking as the head of this family, which he became when your father died. If he believes I'm incompetent, then I must respect his judgment. This is insane, Mom. You're the most competent person I know. That's sweet of you to say, but family loyalty might be clouding your judgment. After all, your brother has a business degree and years of management experience. Surely his assessment of my capabilities is more objective than yours. Sarah was crying now, soft sobs that broke my heart even as I maintained my resolve. Mom, please, I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is. Then perhaps it's time you learn to swim on your own, darling. You're a grown woman with a responsible job and 2 wonderful sons. I have complete faith in your ability to manage your own affairs. But what if I mess up? What if I miss a payment or forget a due date? And then you'll learn from the experience, just as I did when I was your age and managing these things for the first time. You had Dad to help you. The words hung between us, heavy with the weight of loss and the reality of my current isolation. She was right, of course. Harold had been my partner in everything, including the financial management of our household. But I'd also learned to manage alone after his death, just as she would learn to manage now. Yes, I did have your father, I said softly. But I also had to learn to do things on my own when circumstances required it, just as you will. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness for a long time. The house felt different somehow, as if the severing of these financial ties had changed its very structure. For 15 years, my kitchen table had been command, central for 3 households. Bills arrived here, payments were made from here, problems were solved from here. Tomorrow, that would all change. The phone rang intermittently throughout the evening. Michael called twice more, his messages growing progressively more frustrated. David called once, sounding confused and slightly panicked. Jennifer called, her voice artificially sweet as she tried to convince me to reconsider for the good of the family. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I made myself a simple dinner of tomato soup and grilled cheese, the same meal I'd made for my children, countless times when they were small, and the world's problems seemed manageable. I ate slowly, savoring both the food and the strange sense of liberation that had been growing throughout the day. For 15 years, I'd carried the weight of 4 households' financial obligations. I'd lost sleep worrying about their bills, spent countless hours on hold with customer service representatives, negotiated payment plans and extensions, and absorbed the stress of their financial emergencies as if they were my own. Now, for the first time since Harold's death, I was responsible only for myself. As I prepared for bed, I realized I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd been carrying a burden I hadn't fully recognized until I set it down. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. My children would face the reality of managing their own affairs, and some of them would struggle. There would be late fees and service disconnections, frantic phone calls, and desperate requests for help. But tonight I slept deeply and peacefully, knowing that I'd done exactly what needed to be done. Michael had called me too senile to handle money, and I'd simply agreed with him. If his assessment was correct, then removing myself from their financial lives was the most responsible action I could take. If his assessment was wrong, well, then he was about to get a very expensive education in the value of the mother he'd so casually dismissed. Either way, the lesson was about to begin. The next morning brought fresh determination and a stack of legal documents that needed notarization. I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to Harold's funeral and every important occasion since. If I was going to complete the dismantling of 15 years of financial entanglement, I was going to do it with dignity. The bank was my first stop. Mrs. Patterson, the branch manager who'd known me for over 20 years, looked genuinely distressed as she processed the paperwork to remove me from my children's accounts. Lily, I have to say, this seems very sudden. Just last week you were here handling Sarah's overdraft protection like you have for years. Things change, Margaret, I replied, signing the final form with my usual careful signature. My family has decided I'm no longer capable of handling such responsibilities. Margaret Patterson frowned, her professional composure slipping slightly. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're one of the most financially astute customers we have. Your own accounts are managed flawlessly, and you've never made an error on any of the family accounts you handle. Nevertheless, my son believes I'm becoming senile, and I'm sure he knows best. Your son is wrong, she said bluntly, then caught herself and added more diplomatically, in my professional opinion, of course. As I left the bank, I reflected on the curious fact that everyone who dealt with me professionally seemed utterly baffled by the suggestion that I was mentally declining. It was only my own family who saw signs of incompetence in my behavior. The legal aspects of untangling my involvement took most of the morning. Powers of attorney were revoked, authorized user agreements canceled, and automatic payment authorizations terminated. Each signature felt like cutting another tie that bound me to my children's daily lives. By noon, it was finished. 3 decades of being financially intertwined with my children's lives had been severed in less than 24 hours. They were now completely responsible for their own bills, their own due dates, their own financial decisions. As I drove home, I wondered how long it would take for the reality to sink in. Michael's mortgage payment was due in 4 days, Sarah's car payment in 17, David's rent in 9. The electric bills, insurance premiums, medical copays, and dozens of other obligations would continue arriving on schedule, but now they would arrive at addresses where no one had been preparing for them. I spent the afternoon organizing my own simplified financial life. Without the complexity of managing 3 additional households, my own bills seemed almost trivially simple. House payment, utilities, insurance, groceries, and the modest expenses of a woman living alone. Everything fit in a single folder that would have been lost among the multiple systems I'd maintained for my children. The quiet of the house felt different now. Not lonely exactly, but expectant. As if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. The answer came sooner than I'd anticipated. At 4:30, David's car pulled into my driveway with a screech of brakes. That suggested panic rather than a casual visit. He burst through my front door without knocking, his hair disheveled and his usual easygoing demeanor nowhere in evidence. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, then immediately looked stricken. "Sorry, I didn't mean to swear, but I just got off the phone with my landlord and he says you're not paying my rent anymore?" I set down my teacup and looked at my youngest son with the same calm expression I'd perfected during his teenage years when he'd come home with scraped knees and elaborate explanations for why he was 2 hours past curfew. "That's correct, David. I'm no longer handling anyone's bills." "But why? Did I do something wrong?" The genuine confusion in his voice almost broke my resolve. David hadn't been part of yesterday's discussion. He'd tried to defend me, in fact, when Michael had made his pronouncement about my mental state, but he was about to pay the price for his brother's arrogance just the same. "You didn't do anything. Wrong, sweetheart. Your brother has decided that I'm too old and confused to handle financial responsibilities, so I'm simply removing myself from all such arrangements." David stared at me as if I'd announced I was joining the circus. "But that's insane. Michael was being a jerk, but that doesn't mean you have to punish all of us." "I'm not punishing anyone," I replied gently. "I'm simply accepting your brother's assessment of my capabilities and acting accordingly. Mom, my rent is due in 9 days. I don't have it. You know I don't have it." I did know that. David's last project had ended 3 weeks ago, and his next one wouldn't start for another month. In the gap, I'd been covering his basic expenses as I had countless times before, but those days were over. "Then I suppose you'll need to find it somewhere else," I said matter-of-factly. "Where?" "I've got maybe $200 in my checking." account, and rent is $850. Perhaps you could ask your brother for a loan. After all, he's apparently much better equipped to handle financial matters than I am." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that my heart clenched. "Mom, please, you know Michael won't lend me money. He thinks I'm irresponsible. And yet, he's the one who gets to decide whether I'm competent to help you. Interesting how that works, isn't it?" For the first time since he'd arrived, David seemed to grasp the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about money, or bills or missed payments. This was about respect and consequences, and the way families could take each other for granted until it was too late. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "I want you to figure it out, David. You're 35 years old. You have a college degree and considerable talent. Surely you can find a way to earn $650 in 9 days. But I've never had to. No, you haven't, because I've always been there to catch you when you fell. But according to your brother, I'm too senile to be trusted with that responsibility anymore." David sank into Harold's chair, looking smaller and younger than his years. "This is all Michael's fault. Is it?" I asked. "Or is it the natural consequence of taking someone for granted until you don't have them anymore?" He looked up at me with eyes that were finally beginning to understand. "You're really not going to help me, are you?" "I'm helping you more than you realize, sweetheart. I'm helping you learn to stand on your own 2 feet." After David left, the house felt charged with potential energy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I knew that similar conversations were happening or would happen soon with my other children. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in, and desperation would follow close behind. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more aspect of this situation that needed to be addressed, one more lesson that needed to be taught. Because Michael's casual dismissal of my competence hadn't just been insulting, it had been revealing. Tomorrow, I would begin Phase 2 of my education campaign, and by the time I was finished, my eldest son would understand exactly how much his supposedly senile mother had been protecting him from. The first domino fell on Thursday morning at precisely 9:15. I was watering my African violets when I heard the distinctive rumble of the city utilities truck pulling up to Michael's house 3 blocks away. From my kitchen window, I could see the technician walking purposefully toward his front door with that clipboard that meant only one thing: service disconnection. I wasn't surprised. The electric company had a strict policy about late payments, and Michael's account had shown a pattern of relying on my timely interventions to avoid service interruptions. Without those interventions, the natural consequences were as predictable as sunrise. My phone had been ringing steadily since 6 that morning. 23 missed calls from Michael, 14 from Jennifer, 8 from Sarah, and 6 from David. I'd listened to exactly none of the voicemails, though I could imagine their escalating tone of panic as the reality of their situation crystallized. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 15 years, I'd shielded them so effectively from the consequences of late payments that they'd forgotten such consequences existed. Now they were learning that creditors and utility companies operated on schedules that didn't accommodate family drama or hurt feelings. At 10:30, Jennifer's silver Honda pulled into my driveway with more speed than was strictly necessary in a residential neighborhood. She practically ran to my front door, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. Her designer blazer was wrinkled, her makeup hastily applied, and her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd dressed in a hurry. I opened the door before she could knock, greeting her with the same warm smile I'd worn for every family visit over the past 15 years. "Jennifer, dear, what a lovely surprise. Would you like some coffee?" "Mom, Lily, thank God you're home," she said, stepping inside without invitation. "We need to talk." "Of course, sweetheart. Let's sit in the parlor." I led her to the front room where Harold's furniture still dominated the space. Jennifer perched on the edge of the sofa as if she might need to flee at any moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mom, Lily," "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," she began, her voice carrying the kind of desperate cheerfulness people used when they were trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. "Michael didn't mean what he said the other night. He was just stressed about work and—" "Oh, but I think he meant exactly what he said," I interrupted gently, settling into my favorite chair with the measured calm of someone who held all the cards. "He was quite clear about his concerns regarding my mental decline." Jennifer's face flushed slightly. "He wasn't talking about mental decline. He was just worried about putting too much responsibility on your shoulders." "Is that what he told you?" I asked, tilting my head with genuine curiosity. "Because what I heard was that people my age start to get confused about numbers, and that it wasn't fair to any of us to pretend otherwise about my condition." The words hung in the air between us like an indictment. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the accuracy of my recollection even as she tried to find a way around it. "He was just being cautious," she said weakly. "Cautious about what exactly? My senility? You're not senile, Mom Lily. Everyone knows that. Everyone except my own son, apparently." Jennifer stood abruptly and began pacing in front of the fireplace, her composure finally cracking under the weight of her desperation. "Okay, fine. Michael was wrong. He was completely, utterly wrong, and I'll make sure he apologizes. But right now, we have bigger problems." "Do we?" "They turned off our electricity this morning. Our mortgage payment is overdue. The insurance company is threatening to cancel our policy. Everything is falling apart." I made a sympathetic sound. "How terrible for you, but surely Michael can handle these issues." After all, he's the one who determined that financial management was too complex for someone with my declining mental faculties. Jennifer stopped pacing and stared at me with something approaching desperation. "Mom Lily, you know Michael can't keep track of all these bills. He's never had to. You've been handling everything for so long that we don't even know what bills we have or when they're due." "That does sound like a problem," I agreed. "But I'm sure Michael will figure it out. He's a very intelligent man with years of management experience. Certainly more qualified than a confused old woman like myself." "Stop saying that," Jennifer snapped, then immediately looked stricken by her own outburst. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to snap. It's just, we need your help." "I'm afraid that's not possible, dear. As Michael explained, it wouldn't be fair to any of us for me to pretend I'm still capable of handling such responsibilities." Jennifer sank back onto the sofa, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling completely. "What do you want?" "From us? What will it take for you to help us again?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I studied my daughter-in-law's face, seeing not the poised professional woman who'd married my son, but a frightened person facing consequences she'd never had to consider before. "I want nothing from you, Jennifer. This isn't about what I want. This is about accepting reality." "What reality?" "The reality that actions have consequences. The reality that respect, once lost, isn't easily regained. The reality that when you call someone incompetent, you can't then turn around and demand their competent assistance when it suits you." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She hadn't been the one to call me senile after all. She'd been caught in the crossfire of her husband's arrogance and was now paying the price for his poor judgment. "Michael will apologize," she said again, though her voice lacked conviction. "He'll admit he was wrong." "Will he? Or will he apologize because he needs my help, not because he genuinely believes he misjudged me?" The distinction seemed to hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She'd known Michael long enough to understand the difference between genuine remorse and strategic apology. "Please," she whispered, "we can't lose our house." "Then I suggest you contact your mortgage company and arrange a payment plan. Many lenders are willing to work with borrowers who communicate proactively about payment difficulties." but we don't even know who to call or what to say. The information is on your mortgage statement. The one that's been mailed to your house every month for 5 years, even though I've been paying it for you." Jennifer left 20 minutes later, her usual confidence replaced by the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd just realized how deep the water was around her. I watched her drive away, noting the way she gripped the steering wheel and the careful speed with which she navigated the neighborhood streets. Even her driving reflected her new understanding that safety nets weren't guaranteed. The afternoon brought David, though his approach was less frantic than his sister-in-law's had been. He knocked on my door at 2:00, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets and his expression resigned rather than panicked. "Hey, Mom," he said when I opened the door. "Can we talk?" "Of course, sweetheart. Come in." We settled in the kitchen this time, the same place where we'd shared countless conversations over the years. David had always been my most communicative child, the one who'd sought my advice about everything from career choices to relationship problems. Today, though, he seemed to be struggling with where to begin. "I talked to my landlord again," he said finally. "He's being cool about it, but he made it clear that this is my last chance. If I'm late with rent again, he's evicting me. That seems reasonable. Landlords have their own bills to pay. Mom, I've been trying to find work, but you know how freelance goes. Sometimes there's plenty, sometimes there's nothing. I did know. David's income had always been erratic, which was why I'd maintained such careful oversight of his expenses. During good months, I'd encourage him to save. During lean months, I'd cover the gaps. It had been a delicate balance that required constant attention and occasional tough love. "Perhaps it's time to consider more stable employment," I suggested. "I've been thinking about that, actually. There's a design firm downtown that's been trying to recruit me for months. The pay would be steady, and they offer benefits." "That sounds promising." "Yeah, but the thing is, they want someone who can start immediately. And I've got this project I'm supposed to finish first. It's not paying much, but I committed to it." I nodded, recognizing the ethical dilemma he was facing. David had always been conscientious about his commitments, sometimes to his own financial detriment. "How long would it take to finish your current project?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "But the firm needs someone now, and I can't afford to wait for another opportunity like this to come along." "So, what are you going to do?" David leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in the gesture that had become his trademark when he was stressed. "I don't know. I've never had to make these kinds of decisions on my own before. You've always been there to help me think through the options. And now? Now I'm realizing how much I've been depending on you, not just for money, but for guidance, I guess. For helping me see the big picture when I get caught up in the details." It was perhaps the most mature thing I'd heard from David in years. The recognition that my support had gone beyond financial assistance to include the kind of strategic thinking and long-term planning that he'd never had to develop himself. "What does your instinct tell you to do?" I asked. "Honestly, I think I should take the stable job and figure out a way to hand off the freelance project to someone else. The client might not be happy, but in the long run, financial security is more important than one project." That sounds like wise thinking. "Yeah, but what if I'm wrong? What if I burn bridges with the freelance client and then the corporate job doesn't work out? Then you'll learn from the experience and make better decisions next time." David studied my face as if he were trying to read something written there in invisible ink. "You're not going to tell me what to do, are you?" "No, sweetheart. I'm not. Even though you could help me figure this out in about 5 minutes? Even though?" He was quiet for a long moment, processing this new reality. This is part of the lesson, isn't it? Not just about money, but about growing up, I guess. What do you think? I think I've been a 35-year-old child, and it's taken losing your safety net for me to realize it. The honesty in his voice was both heartbreaking and encouraging. Of all my children, David seemed to be grasping the deeper implications of this situation most clearly. I also think, he continued, that Michael was an idiot for calling you senile, and we're all paying the price for his stupidity. Language, David. Sorry, but it's true. You're the sharpest person I know, and anyone who can't see that is blind. Your brother sees what he wants to see, just like most people do. Well, what he wanted to see just cost him his electricity, and might cost him his house. David left an hour later, but not before giving me a hug that felt different from his usual casual embraces. This one carried weight, recognition, and perhaps the beginning of genuine respect for the woman who'd been managing his life behind the scenes for so long. The evening brought Sarah, and her arrival was announced by the sound of her 15-year-old Honda coughing and sputtering in my driveway. The car had been giving her trouble for months, but the repair estimates had been beyond her budget. I'd been setting aside money for a down payment on a newer vehicle, but that plan, like so many others, had been derailed by recent events. Sarah knocked softly on my door, and when I opened it, I was struck by how exhausted she looked. Her nursing scrubs were wrinkled from a long shift, her hair was escaping from its ponytail, and her eyes carried the particular weariness of someone who'd been running on empty for too long. "Hi, Mom," she said quietly. "I hope it's not too late to stop by." "It's never too late for you, sweetheart. Come in." We ended up in the living room, Sarah curled up on one end of the sofa like she used to do as a teenager when she needed to talk about boy problems or friendship drama. Some gestures transcend age, and the way she tucked her feet under herself reminded me powerfully of the girl she'd been before life got so complicated. "I got a call from the insurance company today," she said without preamble. "They're canceling my car insurance because the payment bounced." "Oh dear." "I thought I had enough in my account to cover it, but I forgot about the medical bills that hit last week. And now I'm looking at a $60 returned check fee on top of everything else." Sarah had always struggled with the complex juggling act that single motherhood required. Between her irregular shift schedule, her son's activities, and the constant stream of medical expenses that came with raising two active teenagers, her finances were a constant source of stress. "What did the insurance company say when you explained the situation?" "They said I could reinstate the policy if I pay the premium, plus the late fee plus a reinstatement fee. Total of about $350. "And do you have that?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, I have $87 in my checking account and a car that's making noises like it's about to die. My next paycheck isn't for 5 days, and even then, it won't be enough to cover everything that's piling up." I made a sympathetic sound while maintaining my carefully neutral expression. "That does sound challenging." "Challenging." Sarah shook her head. "That's one word for it. Terrifying might be more accurate." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. I've been sitting in your driveway for 20 minutes trying to figure that out." Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller on the sofa. "I keep thinking about what you said about learning to swim on my own, but Mom, I feel like I'm drowning." "Swimming is difficult at first," I said gently, "but once you learn, you never forget." "What if I go under before I learn?" "Then you'll find out how strong you really are." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the street where she'd learned to ride a bicycle, where she'd waited for the school bus every morning for 12 years, where she'd brought her own children to visit their grandmother countless times. "I've been thinking about what Michael said," she finally continued, "about you being confused about numbers and getting older. Have you?" And I realized something. You're not the one who's confused about numbers. I am. I have no idea how much my bills actually cost because you've been paying them for so long that I stopped paying attention. This was closer to the heart of the matter than anything else I'd heard from my children. Sarah was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't my competence, but their dependence. I didn't even know my car insurance cost $212 a month until they told me today. I thought it was maybe $150. And my health insurance premiums? I couldn't even guess. Knowledge is the first step toward control, I said. But what good is knowledge if I don't have the money to do anything about it? You'd be surprised how much control you have once you understand exactly what you're dealing with. Sarah shifted on the sofa, turning to face me directly. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I'm always honest with you, sweetheart. Are you doing this to punish us, or are you doing this to help us? The question was more perceptive than I'd expected from any of my children. Sarah had always been intuitive, but her exhaustion and stress usually prevented her from seeing past immediate problems to larger patterns. What do you think? I think? She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think you're doing both. I think you're angry about what Michael said, and you have every right to be. But I also think you're trying to teach us something we should have learned a long time ago. And what's that? That we've been taking you for granted. That we've been treating you like our personal financial manager instead of our mother. And that we have no idea how to function as adults because you've been doing all the adult stuff for us. I felt a surge of pride in my daughter's insight, even as my heart ached for the pain this lesson was causing her. I also think, she continued, that you're scared. Scared of what? Scared of what happens to us when you're not here anymore. You're 73, Mom. You won't be able to take care of us forever, and maybe you're realizing that we're not prepared for that reality. The accuracy of her observation took my breath away. Sarah had identified something I'd barely acknowledged to myself, that my protective instincts had perhaps done my children a disservice by preventing them from developing their own coping mechanisms. So what are you going to do? I asked. I'm going to figure it out, she said with more determination than she'd shown since arriving. I'm going to call the insurance company tomorrow and see if they'll let me make payments. I'm going to sit down with all my bills and figure out exactly what I owe and when, and I'm going to stop expecting you to rescue me every time I get in over my head. And if you can't make it work, then I'll fail, and I'll learn from failing, and maybe next time I'll do better. Sarah left an hour later, but not before, helping me clear up the teacups and giving me a kiss on the cheek that felt like a promise. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the day's conversations. Each of my children was responding differently to their new reality. Jennifer was panicking and trying to find a way back to the old arrangement. David was beginning to understand the deeper lessons involved, and Sarah was starting to take responsibility for her own growth. But Michael himself had been notably absent. No visit, no phone call since the morning's frantic attempts to reach me. I wondered if he was too proud to admit he needed help, or if he genuinely believed he could solve these problems without acknowledging his mistake. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new revelations. The utility disconnections would continue, the late fees would accumulate, and the reality of their situation would become increasingly unavoidable. But tonight, I slept soundly, knowing that the hardest lessons often produce the most valuable growth. My children were learning to swim in deep water, and while the process was painful to watch, it was also long overdue. The phone woke me at 3:17 in the morning. Michael's name on the caller ID told me everything I needed to know about how his day had ended. Mom. His voice was strained, exhausted, and stripped of the confidence he'd displayed just days earlier. We need to talk. Good morning, Michael. This is quite late for a social call. It's not a social call. It's an emergency. What kind of emergency? The kind where my water just got shut off because I couldn't figure out which company to pay or how much I owed them. I made an appropriately sympathetic sound while privately noting that the water company had moved faster than I'd expected. Their usual grace period was 7 days, which meant Michael's account had been in worse shape than even I had realized. That does sound inconvenient. Inconvenient? His voice cracked slightly. Mom, we have no water. Jennifer can't shower. Before work. The kids can't brush their teeth. We can't flush the toilets. Have you contacted the water company to arrange payment? I tried, but they want the full past due amount plus reconnection fees, and I don't even know what the past due amount is because you are handling it. Surely you have records of the bills. We threw them away because you were taking care of everything. The admission hung between us like a confession. For years, they'd been discarding their own financial documents because they'd assumed I would handle everything. Now they were discovering that assumption had left them completely blind to their own obligations. Michael, I'm sure you can work this out. You're a capable businessman with years of management experience. Stop it, he said quietly. Just stop it. Stop what? Stop throwing my words back at me. I get it, okay? I was wrong about you being senile. I was wrong about everything. Were you? Yes, and I'm sorry. I'm apologizing. Isn't that what you wanted? The question revealed more about Michael's character than perhaps he'd intended. He viewed apologies as transactions, words that could be exchanged for forgiveness and a return to previous arrangements. What I wanted, Michael, was for my eldest son to treat me with the respect I've earned over 73 years of life and 15 years of managing his household's finances without a single error. I know, you're right. I was disrespectful and wrong. And? And what? And what have you learned from this experience? Michael was quiet for so long, I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard since he was a child. I learned that I have no idea how to run my own life without you. The admission was both heartbreaking and encouraging. It suggested that beneath his arrogance and misguided assumptions, my son was capable of genuine self-reflection. That's quite a realization. Mom, I need your help. Not just with the water bill, but with all of it. I need you to teach me how to do what you've been doing for me. Why would you want lessons from someone who's too senile to handle financial responsibilities? Because you're not senile. You're the most competent person I know, and I was an ass for suggesting otherwise. Language, Michael. Sorry, but it's true. I was wrong, and now my family is suffering because of my pride and stupidity. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 3:20 in the morning was perhaps not the ideal time for this conversation, but desperation had a way of stripping away pretense and getting to the heart of matters. Michael, if I were to help you, what assurance would I have that you wouldn't simply return to taking my assistance for granted? I don't know. What kind of assurance would you need? I need to know that you understand the difference between helping and enabling. I need to know that you're ready to take responsibility for your own affairs instead of expecting me to manage them indefinitely. I am. I want to be. I just don't know how. Learning how is part of growing up, even at 42. So you'll help me? I was quiet for a moment, considering not just Michael's immediate crisis, but the larger implications of how I responded. This was a crossroads moment, both for him and for our relationship. I'll consider it, I said finally. But not tonight. Tonight, you need to figure out how to get your water turned back on using your own resources and intelligence. But I don't know how. Then you'll learn. The water company has emergency contact numbers. Your neighbors have working phones if yours doesn't. The internet contains vast amounts of information about dealing with utility companies. Use the skills that made you successful in business to solve this problem. Mom, good night, Michael. We'll talk. Tomorrow, when you've had time to think about what kind of relationship you want us to have going forward. I hung up before he could respond, leaving him to wrestle with his situation alone. It wasn't cruelty that motivated me, but necessity. Until Michael learned to solve problems for himself, any help I provided would simply perpetuate his dependence. As I settled back into bed, I could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the windows and reminding me that storms, while difficult to endure, often cleared the air and made way for new growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for learning. The question was whether my children were ready to embrace both. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful family dinner, and the landscape of my children's lives had changed dramatically. From my kitchen window, I could see the repo truck parked outside David's apartment building, its yellow warning notices still fluttering on doors throughout the neighborhood like fallen autumn leaves. The sight should have filled me with regret, but instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a teacher watching difficult lessons finally take root. The morning had started with Sarah's call, her voice thick with tears and exhaustion. Her car had finally given up completely, leaving her stranded at the hospital after a double shift with no way to get home to her teenage sons. The breakdown had been inevitable, but I'd hoped she might find alternative transportation before it happened. "Mom, I hate to ask," she'd said, her pride wrestling with desperation. "But could you possibly give me a ride home? I know things are complicated right now, but I'm completely stuck." Of course, I'd agreed. Despite everything that had transpired, I wasn't going to leave my daughter stranded at 3 a.m. But as I drove through the empty streets to collect her, I couldn't help but notice how different this request felt from the countless times I'd simply solved her problems without being asked. Sarah had climbed into my car looking older than her 38 years, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from the long shift, and her hair escaping from its practical ponytail. We'd driven in comfortable silence for several minutes before she spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks," she'd said, staring out at the streetlights sliding past her window. "About what you said about learning to swim. And what have you concluded?" "That I've been dog paddling for years, staying afloat but never really learning proper technique. You've been my life preserver, and I never bothered to develop the skills I needed to survive on my own." The metaphor was more apt than perhaps she'd realized. Sarah had been managing the surface responsibilities of her life while I handled the deeper currents that could have pulled her under. "It's not too late to learn proper technique," I'd said gently. "Isn't it? I'm 38 years old with 2 kids and a mortgage I can barely understand, let alone afford. Your father didn't learn to swim until he was 45. Do you remember that?" Sarah had smiled for the first time in weeks. He was so embarrassed, taking lessons at the community center with all those kids. But he learned, and by the end of that summer, he was swimming laps every morning before work. I remember. He said it was never too late to master something that might save your life. We'd pulled into her driveway, but neither of us had moved to get out of the car. These moments of connection had become precious to me, reminders that, beneath the financial chaos and family tension, the bonds between us remained strong. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Sarah had said, turning in her seat to face me directly. "I understand why you're doing this. Not just the money stuff, but all of it. You're trying to prepare us for a world where you won't be here to catch us when we fall." The insight had taken my breath away. Of all my children, Sarah had always been the most emotionally perceptive, but this level of understanding surprised me. "And I need you to know that I'm grateful, even though it's terrifying. Because you're right. I wasn't prepared for anything, and that's not fair to you or to my boys." I'd watched her walk to her front door, noting the way she held her shoulders, straighter despite her exhaustion. Sarah was learning to carry her own weight, and while the process was painful, it was also necessary. Now, hours later, I was preparing for what I suspected would be the most difficult conversation yet. Michael had called that morning, his voice stripped of its usual confidence and authority. The past 3 weeks had taken their toll on my eldest son in ways that went beyond mere financial inconvenience. His house had been without reliable utilities for over a week. The mortgage company had initiated foreclosure proceedings after 2 missed payments. His credit score had plummeted, affecting everything from his car loan to his employment, since his company required periodic credit checks for management positions. Most devastating of all, Jennifer had taken their children to stay with her, parents, claiming she couldn't subject them to the instability Michael's poor decisions had created. When I opened the door at the appointed time, I barely recognized the man standing on my porch. Michael's usually impeccable appearance had deteriorated, along with his circumstances. His expensive suits had been replaced by wrinkled khakis and polo shirts. His carefully styled hair looked as if he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. Most telling of all, his eyes carried the haunted expression of someone who'd discovered that competence couldn't be assumed or inherited. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said quietly, stepping inside when I gestured him forward. We settled in the living room, the same space where this drama had begun, but the dynamic between us had shifted fundamentally. Michael sat hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, looking more like a chastened schoolboy than a successful businessman. "I owe you an apology," he began, then paused as if the words were physically difficult to produce. "Not the kind I offered before, when I was just trying to get you to help us out of this mess. A real apology for the way I spoke to you, for the assumptions I made about your capabilities, and for taking your support for granted for so many years." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to untangle 15 years of financial arrangements, and I finally understand what you've been doing for us all this time. It's not just paying bills, is it? It's a complete management system that requires attention to detail, long-term planning, and constant vigilance." "It is quite complex," I agreed. "I found records going back to when Jennifer and I were first married. You weren't just helping us occasionally. You were essentially running parallel financial lives for all of us, making sure nothing fell through the cracks, negotiating with creditors when problems arose, even planning for expenses we didn't know were coming." Michael stood and began pacing, the same nervous energy that had characterized his childhood when he was working through difficult problems. "The mortgage alone involves 17 different components: the monthly payment, escrow management, property tax calculations, insurance coordination, PMI tracking, and a dozen other things I never even knew existed. And that's just one bill among dozens you were managing for each of us." "I did try to keep things organized," I said mildly. "Organized?" Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, what you were doing was miraculous. You were essentially functioning as a personal financial manager for 4 separate households, and you never missed a deadline, never made an error, never let any of us suffer consequences for our own lack of attention." He stopped pacing and looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "And I called you senile for mixing up 2 numbers. You were concerned about my mental decline," I said, maintaining the gentle tone I'd used throughout this ordeal. "I was an arrogant fool who thought success in business made me qualified to judge everyone else's competence." Michael returned to his seat, leaning back with the exhausted posture of someone who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for him. "Jennifer left me," he said quietly. "She took the kids and moved in with her parents. She says she can't trust me to provide stability for our family anymore. I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" "Because I think this is exactly what you expected would happen when you withdrew your support." "Art?" The accusation hung in the air between us, not hostile but genuinely curious, as if Michael was trying to understand whether my actions had been calculated to cause maximum disruption or simply to teach necessary lessons. "What I expected," I said carefully, "was for you to learn the difference between competence and arrogance." "Have I?" "What do you think?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the kind of genuine reflection I hadn't seen from him in years. "I think I've learned that competence isn't just about intelligence or education or professional success. It's about attention to detail, consistency, and the humility to recognize what you don't know. And I think I've learned that calling someone incompetent is easy when you've never had to do their job yourself. It was perhaps the most mature thing I'd heard from Michael since he'd reached adulthood. But there was still more he needed to understand before we could move forward. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Anything. Why did you really question my mental competence that night at dinner? He frowned, clearly not understanding the direction of my question. Because you mixed up the numbers on our mortgage payment. Is that the only reason? What do you mean? I studied his face carefully, watching for signs that he understood the deeper implications of what I was asking. I mean, was there any other reason you might have wanted to question my mental sharpness that particular evening? Michael's expression remained genuinely puzzled. I don't understand what you're getting at. Think carefully, Michael. Was there anything else happening with your finances that might have made you uncomfortable with my level of oversight? Like what? I reached into the side table drawer and withdrew a manila folder I'd been keeping there for several weeks. Michael's eyes followed my movements with growing concern as I opened it and spread several documents across the coffee table between us. Like the fact that over the past 6 months, there have been regular discrepancies in your checking account, balance that don't match the bills I've been paying on your behalf. Michael leaned forward to examine the papers, his face going pale as he recognized bank statements, payment confirmations, and a detailed ledger showing the discrepancies I'd discovered. I don't understand, he said weakly. Neither did I, initially. Small amounts, never enough to cause obvious problems, but consistent enough to create a pattern. Money disappearing from your account that couldn't be accounted for by any of the bills or expenses I was managing. I pointed to specific entries on the ledger, each one representing hours of careful investigation and cross-referencing. At first, I thought it might be banking errors or hidden fees I wasn't aware of. But when I contacted your bank to inquire about the discrepancies, I learned something very interesting. Michael's hands were shaking as he picked up one of the bank statements, scanning the entries with growing comprehension and horror. There were additional automatic payments being made from your account, payments I hadn't authorized for credit, cards I didn't know existed. Oh, God, Michael whispered. Credit cards that were opened in your name, but used by someone else. Someone with access to your personal information and your financial accounts. The truth hit Michael like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, the bank statement falling from his nerveless fingers. Jennifer, he said, the name barely audible. I discovered the unauthorized cards 2 weeks before our family dinner. I was trying to decide how to approach you about it when you made that comment about my mental decline. I gathered the papers back into their folder, my movements careful and deliberate. When you attributed my error with the mortgage amount to senility, I realized you weren't going to take my concerns about financial irregularities seriously, so I decided to conduct a test. A test? I deliberately transposed those numbers to see how you and Jennifer would react. Would you investigate the discrepancy? Would you ask questions about how such an error might have occurred? Or would you simply dismiss it as evidence of my declining mental faculties? Michael's face was ashen as he processed the implications of what I was telling him. You chose to dismiss it. More than that, you chose to publicly humiliate me, rather than consider that I might have had a reason for the apparent mistake. You knew about the credit cards all along? I suspected. The test confirmed not only that Jennifer was stealing from your accounts, but that she was confident enough in her ability to manipulate you that she felt safe encouraging your disrespect toward me. Michael buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or rage or both. How long? He asked without looking up. Based on the bank records, approximately 8 months. The amount started small, probably to test whether you were paying attention to your statements. When you didn't notice, they gradually increased. How much? just over $11,000. The amount hit Michael like another physical blow. He raised his head to stare at me with something approaching desperation. Why didn't you just tell me directly? Because, my dear boy, you had already decided I was too senile to be trusted with financial matters. How receptive do you think you would have been to accusations against your wife from someone you'd just declared mentally incompetent? The logic was inescapable, and Michael seemed to crumble under the weight of it. So, when you withdrew your financial support, I was protecting myself from being blamed when the theft was eventually discovered, and I was forcing you to pay enough attention to your own finances that you would inevitably uncover what Jennifer was doing. But you let us suffer. You let me lose my house, my credit, my family. I let you experience the natural consequences of your choices. You chose to trust Jennifer with access to your accounts. You chose to ignore your financial statements. You chose to dismiss my competence when I tried to alert you to problems. Michael was crying now, tears of rage and humiliation and dawning understanding streaming down his face. Most importantly, I continued gently, you chose to treat your mother with disrespect rather than gratitude for 15 years of flawless service. What do I do now? He asked, his voice broken. Now you decide what kind of man you want to be going forward. Do you want to be someone who learns from his mistakes, or someone who looks for others to blame for his problems? I want to learn. I want to fix this. Then you start by taking responsibility for your own financial life. You contact the police about Jennifer's theft. You work with your bank and the credit card companies to recover what you can. You rebuild your credit through consistent, responsible behavior over time. In our relationship, I studied my eldest son's face, seeing not the arrogant businessman who'd dismissed my competence, but the vulnerable little boy who'd once trusted me to kiss his scraped knees and make everything better. Our relationship depends on whether you can learn to treat me as an equal, rather than as your personal financial manager, or a burden to be managed. Michael nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that reminded me powerfully of his childhood. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, Michael. It's about what I choose to offer and what you choose to do with it. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelations settling between us, like dust after an explosion. Outside, I could hear the sounds of normal suburban life continuing. Children playing, dogs barking, lawnmowers humming. The world had continued spinning while my family's universe had been turned upside down. Will you help me? Michael asked finally. Not to fix my problems, but to learn how to fix them myself? I'll consider it, if you can demonstrate that. You understand the difference. What do you need me to do? I need you to spend the next month managing your own affairs completely independently. No calls for advice, no requests for loans, no attempts to get me to solve problems for you. But what if I make mistakes? Then you'll learn from them. Mistakes are only failures if you refuse to grow from them. Michael left an hour later, carrying copies of the financial documents that proved Jennifer's theft and a written plan for addressing his legal and financial problems. But more importantly, he left with something he'd been lacking for years, a realistic understanding of his own capabilities and limitations. 2 days later, David knocked on my door with news that transformed the entire trajectory of his life. The design firm downtown had not only held the position open for him, but had offered him a signing bonus significant enough to cover his back rent and security deposit on a better apartment. The crazy thing is, he told me over coffee in my kitchen, I never would have taken the risk of applying for a corporate job if I hadn't been desperate. I was so comfortable with the safety net you provided that I never pushed myself to grow professionally. And now I'm terrified and excited and grateful all at the same time. I start Monday, and for the first time in my adult life, I'll be completely financially independent. Sarah's transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. After her car breakdown, she'd researched public transportation options and discovered that the hospital offered shuttle services for employees working late shifts. More importantly, she'd applied for and received a promotion to charge nurse, a position that came with both increased responsibilities and a salary that would allow her to manage her expenses without assistance. I never considered applying for management positions before, she explained during one of our weekly coffee dates. I always told myself I was too busy or too tired or not qualified enough. But the truth was, I was too comfortable letting you handle the complex stuff while I focused on day-to-day survival. And now you're handling both. I'm learning to. It's exhausting, but it's also empowering. I'm making decisions about my life instead of just reacting to circumstances. 3 months later, the entire family gathered again around my dining table for what felt like a completely different kind of dinner. The mahogany surface still bore its familiar scars. The lace curtains still filtered the afternoon sunlight. But everything else had changed fundamentally. Michael arrived alone, his appearance restored to its former precision, but somehow more humble than before. He'd moved into a modest apartment while working to rebuild his credit and save for a house he could actually afford. The divorce proceedings with Jennifer were moving forward, complicated by the criminal charges filed against her for financial fraud. The prosecutor says we might recover about 60% of what she stole, he reported matter-of-factly. And I've learned more about personal finance in the past 3 months than I did in 4 years of business school. David brought his girlfriend, a fellow designer he'd met at his new job who shared his artistic sensibilities but possessed the practical financial skills he was still developing. Their relationship seemed built on mutual respect and shared growth, rather than the dependent dynamic that had characterized his previous romances. "We're thinking about moving in together," he announced over dessert. "But first, we're both taking a financial planning class together. I never want to be that clueless about money again." Sarah's sons had grown noticeably in the months since the crisis began, not just physically, but in their understanding of responsibility and family dynamics. They'd watched their mother struggle and succeed, and the experience had taught them lessons about resilience and self-reliance that no amount of lecturing could have provided. Mom signed up for business classes at the community college, the older boy reported proudly. She says she might want to open her own practice someday. As we shared Harold's favorite apple pie, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. The dinner that had begun this ordeal had been a gathering of adults who were still, in many ways, children depending on their mother to manage the complexities of their lives. Tonight's dinner was a celebration of genuine independence and mutual respect. "I need to tell you all something," I said as we finished our meal. "Something I should have shared months ago." The table fell quiet, my children's faces reflecting varying degrees of concern and curiosity. About 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and Sarah's sharp intake of breath. The diagnosis is very early and the progression is slow, but it's real. My doctor estimates I have several good years ahead of me, but eventually I will need the kind of care and support I've been providing to all of you. David was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I knew that if I revealed the diagnosis before you learned to function independently, you would have used it as an excuse to increase your dependence on me rather than learning to manage on your own." I looked around the table at each of my children in turn, seeing the mix of shock, understanding, and love in their faces. I needed to know that when the time comes that I can no longer take care of myself, you'll be capable of taking care of me. Sarah reached across the table to take my hand, tears streaming down her face. "We will be, Mom. We'll take care of you the way you've taken care of us." "I know you will, sweetheart. But not because you have to, and not because you don't know how to do anything else. You'll take care of me because you choose to, from a position of strength and capability." Michael's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. You were never senile. You were preparing us. I was teaching you to swim in deep water, because someday I won't be there to throw you a life preserver. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd shared as a family. We talked about practical matters like legal documents and healthcare, directives, but we also talked about love and legacy and the ways families can support each other without creating unhealthy dependencies. As my children prepared to leave that evening, each of them embraced me with an understanding that hadn't existed before this crisis began. These were no longer the hugs of people taking comfort for granted, but the embraces of adults who understood the precious and temporary nature of the care we provide for each other. Michael lingered after the others had gone, standing in my doorway as if there was something more he needed to say. Thank you, he said finally. For what? For loving us enough to let us fail, for being strong enough to watch us struggle, for believing we could learn to swim even when we were convinced we would drown. That's what mothers do, Michael. We prepare our children for a world that won't always be as forgiving as we are. I know that now. I just wish I'd understood it sooner. As I watched his taillights disappear down the street, I felt a deep sense of completion. The lesson I'd set out to teach had been learned, not just by my children, but by myself. I'd discovered that the most loving thing a mother can do is not to shield her children from life's challenges, but to prepare them to meet those challenges with competence and dignity. The house felt different that night as I prepared for bed. Not empty as it had for so many years after Harold's death, but peaceful. My children were scattered across the city in their own homes, managing their own lives. But I no longer worried about what would happen to them when I was gone. They had learned to swim in deep water, and that knowledge would serve them well, long after I was no longer there to watch from the shore. As I turned off the bedside lamp, I smiled into the darkness, knowing that sometimes the greatest gift we can give those we love is the confidence to succeed without us. My children had learned that lesson the hard way, but they had learned it completely, and tomorrow they would wake up as truly independent adults, capable of caring for themselves and eventually for me, when the time came that I needed their care in return. The circle would be complete, but it would be a circle of choice rather than obligation, of strength rather than dependence, of love freely given rather than desperately needed. That, I thought as sleep claimed me, was worth every difficult moment of the past few months. 6 months had passed since that transformative family dinner, when I revealed the truth about my condition and the real reasons behind my withdrawal of financial support. The seasons had changed from the crisp autumn when this journey began to the gentle warmth of spring, and like the world around us, my family had undergone its own profound transformation. I was sitting in my garden on a particularly beautiful May morning, tending to the rose bushes Harold had planted for our 25th wedding anniversary, when Sarah arrived for our weekly visit. These had become sacred time for both of us, different from the crisis-driven conversations of months past. Now we talked as equals, two women who had each learned valuable lessons about strength, independence, and the complex dynamics of family, love. The boys made honor roll again, she announced, settling beside me on the garden bench with the easy comfort of someone who had found her footing in life. And Jake got accepted to that summer engineering program he applied for. That's wonderful news. You must be very proud. I am. But more than that, I'm proud of how they've handled everything that's happened. Watching me struggle and then succeed taught them things about resilience that I could never have explained in words. Sarah had indeed succeeded beyond what any of us might have expected. The promotion to charge nurse had led to additional opportunities, and she was now pursuing a master's degree in nursing administration while working full-time. The juggling act was challenging, but she managed it with a competence that would have been unimaginable during the years when I handled her financial complexities. I've been thinking about something you said during the worst of it, she continued. deadheading a few spent blooms with the precise movements I'd taught her as a child. About how swimming was hard at first, but once you learned, you never forgot. Do you feel like you're swimming now? I feel like I'm finally moving through the water instead of just trying not to drown. And the strangest thing is, it's not as hard as I thought it would be once I stopped being afraid of going under. This insight captured something essential about the transformation all my children had undergone. Fear of failure had kept them dependent far longer than necessary, and removing that safety net had forced them to discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. "There's something else," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "I want to talk to you about the future, about what happens when your condition progresses." The conversation I'd known was coming had finally arrived. My children had spent months learning to manage their own lives, and now they were ready to discuss managing mine when the time came. "I've been doing research on dementia care and family support systems," she continued, "and I think we need to have a family meeting to discuss practical arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "Legal documents, medical directives, financial planning, and living situations, but also emotional preparation. We need to talk openly about what you want and need, and how we can provide it while maintaining the independence you've taught us to value." The maturity in her voice was remarkable. This was not the overwhelmed single mother who had once panicked at the thought of managing her own car insurance. This was a confident woman who was thinking strategically about complex family challenges. I think that's a very wise suggestion. I also think we need to involve a professional facilitator, someone who specializes in family discussions about aging and care planning, not because we can't handle it ourselves, but because we want to handle it well. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, Sarah would have expected me to research and arrange such services. Now she was taking the initiative to ensure our family's future well-being. "Have you discussed this with your brothers?" "I've mentioned it, and they're both supportive. Michael especially wants to be involved in planning. I think he sees it as a way to make amends for his previous behavior." Michael's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all my children. The arrogant businessman who had dismissed my competence had evolved into someone who approached every interaction with humility and genuine respect. The legal proceedings against Jennifer had been resolved, with her pleading guilty to fraud charges and agreeing to pay restitution over time. The divorce had been finalized, giving Michael full custody of his children, who had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that children often display when their world is rebuilt on more solid foundations. "He's been taking classes," Sarah continued. "Not just financial planning, but courses on aging, family dynamics, and caregiving. He says he wants to be prepared to support you the way you supported all of us." "And David?" "David's been amazing. He and Rachel are getting married next month, and they've already talked about how they want to be involved in your care when the time comes. They're even looking at houses in the neighborhood so they can be close by." The mention of David's upcoming wedding filled me with quiet joy. His relationship with Rachel had flourished as he'd grown into genuine independence, and their partnership seemed built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than the codependency that had characterized his previous relationships. "They want to have the wedding reception here in the backyard," Sarah added. "If that's all right with you. David says this house has always been the center of our family, and he wants to celebrate his new beginning in the place where he learned to become a man." The request touched me deeply. For years, this house had been command central for managing my children's crises. Now it would host a celebration of their growth and success. I think that would be perfect. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Michael's sensible sedan, purchased after he'd traded his expensive luxury vehicle for something more appropriate to his rebuilt financial situation, pulled up behind Sarah's practical Honda. "I hope you don't mind that I invited him to join us," Sarah said. "We've been coordinating better lately," sharing information instead of competing for your attention. Michael approached us with the measured steps of someone who had learned not to assume his presence was automatically welcome. The confident stride that had once characterized his approach to family gatherings had been replaced by something more thoughtful and respectful. "Good morning, Mom. Sarah." He settled on the grass beside our bench, choosing to position himself slightly below us in a gesture that spoke volumes about his changed perspective on family hierarchy. "I wanted to update you on the financial planning research I've been doing," he said, pulling out a folder that reminded me of the meticulous organization I'd once maintained for their affairs. "I've been working with an elder care attorney and a financial planner who specializes in dementia-related planning." The irony of Michael now managing complex planning processes wasn't lost on any of us, but the dynamic felt different from our previous arrangements. This was collaboration rather than dependence, with Michael taking initiative because he chose to, not because he didn't know how to do otherwise. "What have you learned?" "That there are a lot of options we need to consider, and that the decisions we make in the next year or two will significantly impact the quality of care we can provide as your condition progresses." Michael's clinical tone reminded me of the business presentations he'd once given, but the content was deeply personal and emotionally charged. "For instance, we need to decide whether you want to remain in this house as long as possible, which would require modifications and in-home care, or whether you'd prefer to transition to a specialized facility when the time comes. What do you think would be best?" "I think," Michael said carefully, "that what matters most is what you want, and that our job is to make your preferences possible rather than deciding what's most convenient for us." The response demonstrated a fundamental shift in how Michael approached family relationships. Instead of assuming authority or trying to manage outcomes, he was prioritizing my autonomy and dignity. "I've also been researching the financial implications," he continued. "Long-term care is expensive, but between your savings, Dad's life insurance, and the equity in this house, we should be able to manage whatever level of care you need without compromising anyone's financial stability." "Including yours?" "Especially mine. One of the things I've learned these past months is that my financial stability can't depend on anyone else's resources. If I can't contribute to your care from my own rebuilt foundation, then I haven't really learned the lessons you were trying to teach me." Sarah reached over to squeeze Michael's shoulder, a gesture of approval and support that would have been unthinkable during their previous competitive dynamics. "We've also been talking about emotional preparation," she added, "about how to maintain family relationships and individual identities while dealing with progressive illness." "That's perhaps the most important consideration," I said. "I don't want my condition to define our interactions or reduce our relationships to caregiver and patient roles. Which is why we want to establish good patterns now, while you're still fully capable of advocating for yourself," Michael said. "We want to practice being a family that supports each other without losing individual autonomy." The sophistication of their thinking impressed me. These were not the same people who had once expected me to solve their problems and manage their complications. They had developed the kind of strategic, collaborative approach to challenges that healthy families exhibit. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "The question of forgiveness." Both Michael and I looked at her with surprise. "Not forgiveness for what happened with the bills and the financial crisis," she clarified. "We've worked through that. I'm talking about forgiveness for the years before that, when we took your support for granted and failed to appreciate the sacrifice you were making on our behalf." Michael's face tightened with emotion. "Sarah's right. We need to acknowledge that our behavior toward you wasn't acceptable, long before that dinner when everything came to a head." "You don't need my forgiveness for being human," I said gently. "Families are complicated, and learning to balance support with independence is one of the most difficult challenges any of us face." "But we do need to acknowledge it," Sarah insisted. Because if we don't, we might repeat the same patterns in reverse when you need our care. The insight was profound. Sarah was recognizing that the dependency dynamics we'd struggled with could reemerge in different forms if we weren't conscious. About preventing them? What we want, Michael said, is to care for you in a way that honors your dignity and maintains your autonomy for as long as possible. We want to support you without smothering you, help you without infantilizing you, and love you without overwhelming you with guilt or obligation. How do you propose to do that? By following the example you set for us, Sarah said. By being present without being controlling, helpful without being enabling, and loving without being possessive. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about medical care, legal documents, and financial planning, but also deeper questions about family dynamics, individual growth, and the meaning of interdependence versus codependence. As my children prepared to leave, I reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred. The crisis that began with Michael's casual dismissal of my competence had evolved into a profound restructuring of our family relationships. We had moved from a system based on dependency and assumed obligation to one based on choice, respect, and mutual support. That evening, I sat in Harold's chair in the parlor, surrounded by the legal documents Michael had prepared, the research materials Sarah had compiled, and the wedding planning notes David had dropped off for my review. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children were now managing complex planning processes with the same attention to detail I had once provided for them. But the difference was significant. They were doing this work as a gift of love rather than an obligation of dependence. They were choosing to care for me from a position of strength rather than expecting me to care for them from a position of exhaustion. The phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. David's voice carried the excitement of a man who had found his place in the world. "Mom, I just wanted to thank you again for agreeing to host the reception. Rachel and I went to look at the backyard today, and we can already see how beautiful it's going to be. I'm honored that you want to celebrate there. It's more than that. This house represents everything good about our family. It's where you taught us to be decent people, where you showed us what unconditional love looks like, and where you had the courage to stop enabling us when we needed to learn independence." David's words carried a maturity that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "I also wanted to tell you that Rachel and I have been talking about kids, and when the time comes, we want to raise them the way you raised us. With love and support, but also with expectations and boundaries." That sounds like a very wise approach. We want them to know their grandmother while you're still able to share your wisdom with them, and we want them to learn from watching us care for you as you age. The generational perspective David was taking filled me with profound satisfaction. He was thinking not just about immediate family dynamics, but about the legacy of values and behaviors that would be passed down to future children. "There's one more thing," he said. "Rachel asked me to ask you if you'd be willing to help her learn some of your recipes, not because she expects you to cook for us, but because she wants to be able to make Harold's favorite apple pie for family dinners." The request brought tears to my eyes. Rachel wasn't asking me to take care of her, but to share knowledge that would allow her to take care of others. I would love to teach her. After I hung up, I realized that this was what successful family transitions looked like. Not the dramatic crises and explosive confrontations that had characterized our recent experience, but the quiet passing of knowledge, traditions, and responsibilities from one generation to the next. I pulled out my recipe box, the same wooden container Harold had made for me during our second year of marriage, and began sorting through the cards, thinking about which ones Rachel might want to learn first. The familiar ritual of meal planning, which had once been a source of stress and obligation, now felt like a gift I could offer. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. What had begun as a lesson about respect and competence had evolved into something much deeper, a fundamental restructuring of how we understood family relationships, individual autonomy, and intergenerational care. My children had learned to swim in deep water, but more importantly, they had learned to choose when to swim alone and when to swim together. They had discovered the difference between supporting each other and rescuing each other, between helping and enabling, between love and obligation. And I had learned something equally important, that the most loving thing a parent can do is not to be indispensable, but to raise children who are capable of living full, independent lives while still choosing to maintain strong family connections. The diagnosis of early-stage dementia had initially felt like a devastating loss of control over my future. But the events of the past months had taught me that control was perhaps overrated. What mattered more was trust. Trust in my children's ability to make good decisions, trust in their capacity for growth and change, trust in their love for me and for each other. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the family dinner we would share the following Sunday, the first in our series of monthly gatherings designed to maintain connection while respecting independence. My children would arrive as equals, bringing their own contributions to the meal, their own insights to our conversations, and their own strengths to our collective family life. They would leave not as dependents who had been cared for, but as adults who had chosen to spend time with someone they loved and respected. And in that choice, repeated over and over in small and large ways, we would build the kind of legacy that could withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. The roses Harold had planted continued to bloom outside my window, their beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the pruning they received each season. Like my family, they had grown stronger and more beautiful through the careful cutting away of what was no longer healthy or necessary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for growth. But tonight, I slept peacefully, knowing that the foundations we had built together would support us through whatever seasons lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.